All right, students, English 114, this is video 6A. I'm going to try and keep these straight. So in this one, I'm going to go over the readings for week 1. My plan is not to do a separate lecture for each reading. I think the bulk of our discussion of the readings is going to happen asynchronously in Slack via text. But we're going to have those optional Zoom meetings where you're welcome to come and chat with me individually, town hall style, as a small group, and we can, sort of go further in conversation about the readings. I think some of you probably will find that really helpful. Others, that won't be so much the best way for you to learn, and that's really meant to be there as a supplement if it's helpful to you. What I do want to do every week in terms of lecture is I'm going to try and do one brief video giving you a little overview of different points about the different readings, just to orient you to what we're doing. So, first one for this week, Kipling's poem, White Man's Burden. The main things I want you to think about as you're reading this, or rereading it if you've already read it, is Kipling typically gets discussed as a pretty racist guy. We're going to be reading both this and a short story of his, The Man Who Would Be King. I would argue that we need to complexify that reading a little bit. There's definitely aspects that we could call out as racist, problematic, etc., thinking that the white people are superior to the Native Indians. But he has, I think, a more complex view on that than people might expect. And he's pretty contemptuous of a lot of his fellow white people as well, when he thinks they're behaving badly, and you see that even in this short poem. So as you're reading this, think a little bit about who he's portraying as better, who's worse. You might also think about what leads, a white young man in England in this era to take a dangerous journey to a colony where there's a good chance he won't survive. There were diseases, ships went down in transit, there were native uprisings because the natives did not necessarily appreciate being colonized. There are a lot of ways that he could lose his life. So what was the driving force that led these young men to go and take these colonial posts? And I will give you a hint, it has to do with money. Okay, so that is White Man's Burden. Benedict Anderson, what I gave you is the intro to his book, and the opening to it is pretty dense. I read this in grad school, and it's sort of Marxist theory-ish kinds of stuff, so unless you're interested in Marxism, feel free to skim over that. The main thing that I want to talk about that's relevant to this class is on the last page. He talks about what makes a nation, and he comes up with these 4 characteristics, and there's he italicizes the terms at the start of each paragraph, so that should make it pretty easy for you to find the 4 characteristics. I'm expecting we're going to have some quizzes. I wouldn't be surprised if next week there was a quiz, and needing to define those 4 terms, or at least know what they were, might be on the quiz. So he makes a distinction between nations and kingdoms, sort of traditional structures in the old days. And kingdoms were tied together by, people had the same religion, they had the same, they were related to everybody else, they had the same languages, they had the same cultural practices, etc. And he says nations are structured differently, and he asks, the question of the book really is, if you don't have those intrinsic ties that make you, going to defend this person because they're your cousin or whatever else, what is it that leads members of a nation to be willing to go to war for each other, to die for each other? I grew up in New England, and I would say that I probably have more in common with some people in Canada, just over the border, than maybe people in Texas. And yet, I'm supposed to be part of the same nation as the people in Texas, right? So how do we, what is it that makes these things powerful? and he has a thesis of what that might be. So that's what we're going to discuss, and you don't necessarily have to agree with him. So that last page is the one you should focus on, maybe last 2 pages. Okay, 2 more readings. The short story is by me. I give it to you in part. You'll get to know me better. It's the opening to a book of mine that I wrote about Sri Lankan immigrant stories. But in particular, I give you that one because I wrote it as a frame for the book to give people a sense of what it was like in Sri Lanka in the 1940s for a upper class, relatively wealthy, native, local Tamil brown person in that country. And I wanted to show some of the commonalities with the Irish nuns, who are also coming from a colonial background, and some of the tensions with, he and his wife have a bright young daughter who is potentially going to go off to England to study. And, what are they afraid will happen to her? Do they make the right decision at the end of the story? What are the factors that you think should go into that kind of decision? And, how does colonialism affect all of that, right? Does it give them the family opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise? Does it create problems they wouldn't have otherwise? And you could think about how it inflects gender, how it inflects race, and later on sexual orientation, disability, etc. All of those will become potential factors for you to think about and to write about. So that's the story. And then the last thing, I'm sorry, is super dense because it's a political tract. You can kind of skim it, but what I would recommend is kind of just going through paragraph by paragraph and see if you can pull out the main point. Macaulay is essentially like a member of Congress here. He's a member of the British Parliament. The argument he's making is to them, to the Parliament, saying, hey, we've been in India. We've colonized for a long time, and one of the things we did when we colonized is that we set aside a lot of money to support their 2 ancient languages, Arabic and Sanskrit, the languages in which their histories are written, their holy books are written, etc. And he's essentially similar to a kind of classic Republican position. He's saying, that's a lot of money to spend. This isn't our job. We did this because we thought it would be good for them to preserve their culture, to support their development, etc. But really, if we really want to do good for the natives, and that was the sort of main argument that a lot of the colonizers made, was an uplift argument. They said, we're going to go into these countries and we're going to raise these people up. They are barbarians. You'll hear a lot of language like that. And we are, or they're like animals. And when we get to Orientalism, we'll talk a little more about the specific ways in which they justified what they were doing. But they would sort of say, like, we're going to make their lives better. And Macaulay here is arguing that that what will actually make their lives better is if they learn English. So as you're reading this, think about language. Think about what value you may or may not see to knowing languages other than English. Think about whether, say in the US, we should be funding bilingual education in areas that are perhaps predominantly Spanish speaking. Should government forms be required to be available in Spanish as well as English? Think about countries like Switzerland, which has 4 official languages, and everyone learns all 4 languages in school, so by the time they're adults, they're generally quadrilingual. And is that better? Is that worse? All of these factors. But in particular, think about, in the colonial context, do you have a responsibility to try to help the locals preserve their own religion, their own cultural practices, if you are attempting with very little success and stealing a lot of their stuff in the process? But do you you're in theory attempting to do something good for them, to raise them up, right? I think that, anytime people go off to do terrible things, they usually have a justification. No one's a villain in their own mind. So even if we can look back in history and say, well, those colonialists were terrible, and certainly we can say, well, those slave owners were terrible. At the time, those were everyday people who had somehow come up with a rationale for why they thought what they were doing was okay, was morally justified, was what God wanted of them, etc. So that's kind of what we're poking at here. When you're reading Macaulay, try and think about, in class normally we break up into two teams and we actually debate back and forth. I don't know how well we can do that here. I'll see if I can simulate that a little bit on the Slack maybe. But sort of debate, like imagine you were Macaulay's group of parliamentarians who are like, too much money, we shouldn't be spending it, this is, I need to buy more gold plates for my house. And the other side is saying, the moral correct thing to do is to support these languages. So, okay, hopefully that's helpful. I was going to try and keep it under 10 minutes. It went to 11 minutes. But usually I think these will be useful to you as you go into the readings, so I strongly recommend you watch them. And I think that's it. Next things coming up for everybody, you're going to do the readings, you're going to go through the checklist, and for the week, remember everything's due by Sunday at midnight. And keep an eye on the Slack. Try to check in every day. There are conversations that are going to start happening. I'm hoping it's going to turn into a really lively, vibrant space. And I will be getting back to you very soon with doodle plans for when the optional town hall meetings will be on Zoom. And maybe I can see some of your smiling faces. I would love to do that. Okay, that's it. Thanks, guys. Hope the first week is going great.